Hello, my name is Samantha, and I am here today to talk to you about the listening section of the IELTS test. So let's get started in our review of the listening section. For the structure and timing of the test, the listening section of the test has 4 sections. The test lasts 30 minutes. You have an additional 10 minutes to fill out your answer sheet if you're doing the paper version of the test, or an additional 2 minutes to review your answers if you're doing the computer version of the test. There are 4 sections, as I mentioned. These 4 sections are as follows. 1 is a conversation between 2 people in a social context. Then a monologue, which is 1 person speaking in a social context. Then a conversation with multiple people in an educational context. And the 4th is a monologue in an academic context. For the scores, you can see that you can get a score up to 9. So the band scores go to 9. There are 40 questions on the listening section of the test. And so if you have a score of 39 or 40, you will get that top band score of 9. And if you get 0, you can get a 0, but we go down as low as 4 on the scale. So if you have 11 answers right out of 40, then you would get a 4, and there are half marks as well. So each band has a half level as well. So if you're getting a score of 30, then that would be a band score of 7. So often the schools that you're applying to will say what band score they require. So you can then look at that and convert it to see the number of correct answers you need to get. The subject matter of this section of the test, we have social context and academic context. So for social context, there are situations that can happen in everyday life, things like renting an apartment, booking a hotel, meetings, vacations, lots of bookings, lots of talking to people in a phone conversation to make some plans. For an academic context, there are situations from an educational setting, such as lectures from university courses. So just something that's a little more educational in its focus. Some of the types of questions that you will see on the listening section of the test include table completion. So there are quite a lot of table completion questions on the listening test. So you will be listening to some speech, someone speaking or more than one person speaking, having a conversation, and you will have to fill out something like this. So it will ask you to complete the table, write no more than 3 words for each answer. So that is important. They will give you instructions about how many words are in the answers. So for all of these table completion questions, you should be sure to carefully read the instructions. They will tell you if it's 1 word, 2 words, or 3 words as the limit. So you should always make sure that you have that number of words or fewer. So for this situation, they have a list of different people and their positions, and then you have to fill out what their responsibilities are. So you'll be listening to someone explaining about these 4 people and what they do, and you have to find that information. It won't always be the same type of information that you're filling out, like responsibility for all. Maybe sometimes they will not give you the name and you have to fill out the name. Other times they might not give you the title. So you might have to say that Robert Young is the president. It maybe didn't say president. But here, for this example, it was missing responsibilities for all of them. Then we have another form completion. So tables and forms, they like to get you to fill in the blanks for this section of the test. And the instructions say write no more than, it should say, no more than 3 words and or numbers for each answer. There normally won't be typos in them, but this is a sample from a test, so I guess there was a typo that time. So you have to have 3 words or less, or numbers for each of your answer. So here it's about hotel information. So someone is likely calling someone else to book a stay at a hotel, and you're listening to that conversation, and you have to be able to fill in the blanks. Here they have the ages of the children missing as one of the things that you need to find. Then the price inclusive of, and the name. Likely it won't be an incredibly complicated name to spell if they're asking you to put a name on the test, because some names are very tricky to spell. And then the date of birth. So you need to be listening carefully for date of birth, and then the postcode or postal code. So when you're listening to a conversation like this, it is very important to look at what information is missing quickly at the beginning. If you just listen to the entire conversation and then later try to remember the correct information to fill in the blanks, it is very difficult, even for a native speaker. So you should be looking at the types of blanks that are missing. And then as they begin talking, you can start looking for those pieces of information. And often it's in order. It doesn't have to be in order though, and sometimes they might change something during that conversation. So take notes as you're listening. They might say, how old are your children? And the person might say, they're 6 and 7. And then later they might say, oh, sorry, actually they're 6 and 8. I forgot that one just had a birthday. So it's also something to note that the person might change their mind about the information that they've given you that goes in that blank. Sentence completion is another type of question that you'll see often on these tests. So this example says write no more than 2 words for each answer. So that is your limit, 2 words. Of course, it could be 1 word. The next meeting of the soccer club will be in the blank in Kings Park on the 2nd of July. The first event is a blank. At the final dinner, players receive blank. So again, you need to look at those blanks before you listen to the entire section of audio. You don't get to replay your audio. So it's very important to skim the questions quickly to see what you are looking for. Usually the first sentence out of someone's mouth is not the sentence with the important pieces of information. So while they're saying that the first couple of words, you can quickly look and see what you need to be looking for. And often there will be a little bit of time for you to skim answers as well, or questions or answers. Okay, complete the notes below. So note completion, it's all very similar. It's fill in the blank. So a lot of fill in the blank, but in different forms. So here it says no more than 2 words and or a number for each answer. So you have to be careful not to go over 2 words. And this one's about the behavior of dolphins. So it gives you some information about dolphins. They are found where? That's what we need to know. Usually in shallower seas, carnivores, socializing, they talk about that. So when they're talking about them being very sociable and living in pods, you know that you already have that information. So that's good. You don't need to be taking detailed notes about them being social and living in pods. And then it talks about superpods. So if you hear them say superpods, you know you need to be ready to take down some information. So superpods may have more than blank dolphins. So probably a number of dolphins that you need to be listening for. Note completion again, no more than 3 words for each answer. So Box Telecom, some problems, a drop in the something, growing something, and delays due to a strike, and then causes of the problems, high something, and lack of good something. So this one's a little more vague than some of the others, but now you know that you need to be listening for drop, a drop in something or a decrease in something, growing something else, high something, and a lack of something. So it gives you just these keywords to look for in the text. Sorry, in the audio. I say text, but it's actually audio that you will be hearing. Okay, there are also a lot of multiple choice questions on the listening section of the test. So here we have choose the correct letter, A, B, or C. For each answer, the company expanded in what year? So you need to be listening for the year that the company expanded and the number of permanent staff. So that is another number that you need to be listening for. These are a little bit easier because you don't have to scramble to take down perfect notes and worry about spelling. For these numbers, it's not as bad, but you could write down a number incorrectly. That's easy to do. Spelling is important when you're writing down words, but here you just have to choose the correct one, which I think is nicer. Then there are some short answer type questions, similar to the fill in the blank, but a little bit less structured. So write no more than 3 words and or a number for each answer. What 2 factors can make social contact in a foreign country difficult? So this is not a long essay answer. You can't write extremely long answers for this topic, but you need to summarize in 3 or fewer words what 2 factors they spoke about when you were listening to this audio. And we're doing them here today without listening to the audio as examples. I just want you to be familiar with the types of questions and what to expect on this section of the test. And then you certainly will have to practice listening to the audio, but today is not a practice day, it's an overview day. So I am doing it without the actual audio, but you have to imagine that you're listening to conversations about these things and just be prepared to listen to conversations about things like this. And it is a little harder than it sounds because even if you do understand everything, you're looking for very specific pieces of information. So it's definitely something that you have to practice. You can't just assume that you will be great at this. So even a native speaker, if they took this test, if they weren't prepared, if they didn't know what kind of questions to expect, then they might get a low score just because it's hard to look for the right pieces of information quickly. So matching. For matching here, they have this example. What main problem do the students suggest each company has? Match the company to the problem. The first has been done for you. Choose your answers from the box and write the letters A to G next to questions 23 to 27. So those are your instructions. They have all of these options, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then they have 23 to 27 as the things to match them to. So they did one example for you, which is matching E, employees, to Stacks stationery. So you will be listening to a student talking about some problems that companies have. So you have to check for the problem and then match it to the company. So someone, if they start talking about Princeton Windows, you have to start looking for what is the problem at Princeton Windows. For matching, once again, which opinion does each person express about Mojo's music? Choose your answers from the box and write the letters A to F next to questions 28 to 30. So it gives all of these options. It has good managers. It has been operating for too long. There aren't enough music shops, etc. And then you have to match them with the person who said them. So you'll be listening to these people give their opinions, or you could be listening to one person explain about these people's different opinions. And you just have to match them. Another common type of question on the listening section of this test is to have to label something. So some kind of plan or map or diagram and having to put a label on it. So this example is a small map of Cranley Hill Primary School. So questions 6 to 10, label the map, choose the 5 answers from the box and write the letters A to H next to questions 6 to 10. So you will be looking for bird cages, football field, play equipment, pond, recycling center, etc. And you'll be trying to find where that is. So you'll be listening to someone explaining where all of these things are, and you have to fit them in. So for these types of questions with labeling, some useful phrases to study for this section include some of these words. So you'll be hearing someone describe where things are, which is a whole specific kind of language that you can use. So you have to be sure that you know what all of these things mean. Some of them are very obvious, but I think it is worthwhile to make sure that you know what all of these phrases mean and to try to find some extra ways to explain where things are. So some examples are at the top, at the bottom, of course, at the left or to the right, on the left, slightly north or south or east or west of something. So just north from something else is basically what they're saying there with north of this. So north of the mall, north of the person's house. In the southeast, in that general area that is to the south and the east, just past and before you get to. So be sure that you know what it means when someone says, oh, it's just past the store. So just after the store, but just past is a common way to describe that. And then before you get to, be just before. So just before you get to the store means earlier, and just past is later. So if you're looking at a map, that can kind of help you if they're saying that they're walking from the south and then just past the store, there will be another store that you have to label maybe. Okay. So for these types of questions with labeling of a map or a diagram of some sort, there are a lot of words and phrases that you can study to be sure that you know how to recognize them when someone is explaining where something is on a map. So I'll go through a list of them, but it is just very useful to make sure that you're familiar with words that describe where something is in relation to something else. So if you're both looking at a map together and you can point, of course, that's simple. But if you're talking to someone on the phone, for example, and they're explaining directions of how to get somewhere, they're going to use a lot of words and phrases to compare things to the locations of other things. So some words that you can study to prepare for this type of question include some of these. So at the top, at the bottom, to the left, to the right, on the right of, on the left side of, slightly north or south or east or west of something. So just a little bit further north than that other thing that they're comparing to. So that's important. In the southeast, showing that it is south and east, just past and before you get to, those are important ones. We use them quite commonly. So just past the store is a school. So that means if maybe they're telling you we're walking from the south of the map and you're going to walk just past the store, and then after the store will be a school. I think that was what I said earlier, store and school. But if I said just before you get to the school, there is a store. So then again, your school is after the store. So it's comparing where these objects are or these locations are. In the middle of course, is in the middle. Above, below, inside, outside. Most students are usually familiar with those, but it's good to be sure. Opposite or in front of. Those are some ways to say that something is just across. So they might say across, or they might say just opposite, or just in front of. So those mean similar things. Adjoining, via, and alongside. Sometimes people say via as well. So adjoining, connecting, via, taking that route to go somewhere else, and then alongside is beside. So alongside this road, there is a path or a walking path or a bike path. Clockwise and anti-clockwise. So they might describe something from the top position and then say going anti-clockwise from there. So you have to be familiar with which way is clockwise and which way is anti-clockwise. Some strategies for this section of the test would be to read questions during the allotted time before hearing the audio. Pay close attention to any special instructions. So whenever you're given time to read the questions, you make sure to try to read all of the questions, even if you're just reading them quickly. You can read them in more detail later if you're given the time, but you have to make sure that you know what information you're listening for. It's really important. And then also the special instructions. They will very often, almost always, tell you how many words you need to be putting in any blank. So that's important. And you should try to take some notes while you're listening. So that is a little tricky to do. You're filling in the blanks, you're also taking notes, but it can be really helpful. So taking a few notes while you're listening so that then if you miss something, you can look at your notes so that you can try to find that missing piece of information. Some general tips. Again, about notes, it's very important to take notes because you only get to hear the audio one time. So taking some notes can really save you a lot of stress. If you miss a piece of information, you can look back at your notes. You don't have a lot of time to go through your notes and to go through the questions again, but you will have some time to check if you have missed a piece of information. Pay very close attention to the word count limits. That's something that's worth saying multiple times. If they say use no more than 2 words to fill in the blank and you put 3 words, then your answer is automatically wrong. And maybe you had the right words, but you added 1 extra, and then you missed an opportunity to get your correct marks on that question. So be careful with their rules. Don't fill in the answer sheet right away. So sometimes the information will be repeated or changed later in the recording. So like I mentioned earlier, someone might say someone's age when they're asked, and then they might correct themselves a moment later and say, oh, actually, no, I forgot, they're 1 year older. That happens often. They might be planning a trip, and they might ask, how many days are you staying for? They might say 2 days, and then later, immediately after or later in the conversation, they might say, oh, actually, I forgot that we're leaving on this day. So it's actually 3 days that we will be there. So it's important to make sure that you're taking notes, and you can fill in your answers beside the questions on your notes, but maybe don't fill in your actual answer sheet with your permanent answers until the end. They do give you a little time at the end to do that. You need to be familiar with a variety of accents. So don't only study the North American accent. A Canadian or an American accent is a very common one for lots of people to study. If you are living somewhere with more of a European influence, or you're living in Europe, then you might be more likely to study a British accent. But don't just study the one that you think is most useful to you. Maybe you're moving to Canada, so you're studying only with a Canadian tutor, and you are watching lots of shows with a North American accent. That's great, but you need to be able to understand multiple accents. So the wider variety of accents you're familiar with, the better. The 2 major ones that you'll hear a lot of on the test are British and North American. But if you can familiarize yourself with even more accents, then it will become easier and easier for you to hear, to understand words clearly when someone is speaking in a different accent. So for me, living in Canada, the North American accent is what I use and what I hear most regularly. And even for a native speaker, if you hear an accent from somewhere else, there can be some slight confusion. So I know that some people don't listen to British TV shows very often or listen to British people very often. So even those native speakers might hear someone speaking in a British accent and be a little confused about what words they're saying. They use different vocabulary as well, but also the pronunciation is different. Even the word stress can be different sometimes. But if you are a Canadian native English speaker who has lots of British friends, then you will not have trouble understanding the British accent. So the goal is just to be as familiar as possible with as many other accents as you can. And the fun part of that is that you don't have to only study these different accents. You can watch TV or videos that have other accents, and that's a great way to study, even though it doesn't feel like studying. So when you're studying, allow yourself to listen to the audio multiple times when you first start practicing. After you're comfortable with the test, you can start to time it and listen only once. So something that sometimes my students want to start right away is to start doing timed tests. So their very first time practicing for the test, listening to the audio, they want to do it exactly like the test. You can do that, but I think it is more effective, personally, from my studies of languages and from teaching my students. I think it is a much more thorough way to do it if you start slowly. If you've never done the IELTS test before, then you need to learn the structure of this test very well. You need to familiarize yourself very well with the types of questions and how to answer them. And when you're doing that, I think it's good to take your time. So instead of taking 2 minutes to listen to something, take the 2 minutes and then listen again until you find all of the right answers. It's training your ear, it's training your brain, it's helping you to practice and get more familiar with this type of question. And the more times you do it, then the more of an expert you become at answering those types of questions. So do it and take your time in the beginning, and that applies to all sections of the IELTS test. I really do believe that you should be doing it slowly the first time you're starting to study, or just earlier on in your studies. If you've already done the IELTS test multiple times and you feel like you're really, really familiar with it and you already get pretty good scores, but you're just trying to make it a tiny bit more perfect, maybe you want to keep doing timed tests. But I think it's always helpful to do them more slowly at first when you're getting really good answers, when you're giving yourself the chance to listen multiple times and you're studying and you're looking at your answers, you're looking at your notes multiple times. Without a time limit, and then your scores start to improve, that's when you can start timing yourself. I always think it's better to master something before you try to do it quickly. If you're not very good at something and you try to do it at top speed, then you're going to really be frustrated. You're not going to get a great score. So get really great at it and then start doing it on a time limit if you do have time to study. And I recommend that you start studying very early for your IELTS test if possible. And it will never be the same. Okay. So another tip is to practice listening to audio that has a transcript to check later. Take notes when listening and compare them to the transcript. So this is something you can do with many forms of audio, not just IELTS practice tests. So TED Talks, music, YouTube videos, etc. One of my favorite things to get students to do is to listen to TED Talks. I like to listen to them as well. But for students, a feature that I think is very useful for the official TED Talk website is that they have the transcripts available. So most videos that you watch on their website, you'll have the function just below the video to click on something that says transcript, and it will take you down to the transcript. And actually, when you're listening, it will highlight the section of the text that the speaker is on, or when you click on a section, it will take you to that section of the video. So they're linked in a really interactive way so that you can get them to repeat something, and you can check what they said in a specific portion of that video, which I think is really helpful. Again, if you're at a really advanced level and you think that you don't need to look at the transcript, or you think that you don't need as much practice with going back and forth, that's fine, but I do think it's worth trying at least a few times, even for advanced speakers. But if you're studying for this test, I assume that you still have some room for improvement. And I think that listening to the audio without looking at subtitles or without looking at a transcript first is best, then looking at the transcript and comparing. So if you're watching TV, for example, if you can listen without subtitles, that's a great exercise for being able to do this section of the test. So it is something that is not quite as easy, obviously, but on the test, you don't get a transcript to follow along with. You only have the audio. So it's a really good activity to see if you can listen to native speakers speak without being able to read along. And of course, watching TV with subtitles is still very helpful. But if you do it sometimes without the subtitles or without looking at the transcript while you're listening, then I think you are practicing even more for this section of the test. But then afterwards, if you can do it again with the subtitles or with transcript, I think that's the best activity, especially if you're taking notes. So watching a TED Talk, taking some notes, and then going back to see if your notes are really accurate and seeing how they compare to the transcript. Another thing you can do this with is music. That is also quite difficult. A lot of native speakers can't accurately record the lyrics when they're listening to a song, but it's a good thing to try. And then listening to the music again after you've reviewed the actual lyrics for that song, then suddenly your ear can hear things that you didn't hear originally. And I think that's a really good exercise. And I've done that for other languages as well. So if you can listen to some English music, try to write down some lyrics, then read the lyrics and listen to it again. Then you can learn the words to your favorite song more accurately, and you're also practicing for a test in a more fun way and a slightly more creative way than usual. Next tip is to transfer your answers to the answer sheet carefully. So spelling and grammar count. So be sure to write the answers correctly. Don't just ignore spelling because it's a fill in the blank test. The answers have to be written accurately. And one note to think about is that British and American spelling both count as correct. So I would recommend that you just use whichever you're the most comfortable with. If you've been studying with a North American tutor for years, if that's what they taught in your schools and you're planning to move to North America, then you don't have to suddenly learn the British spelling for words. And the same goes for the opposite. If you've been studying only British spelling and accents, then as your primary way of learning English, you don't have to learn American spelling. So whichever one you're more familiar with, but be sure that you are listening to both kinds, but your spelling doesn't have to change for this test. Any correct spelling for both of those types of English will be correct. Don't leave anything blank on the test. Points are not taken away for wrong answers. So even if you heard nothing, you completely missed a segment of what they were saying. Maybe it was like the number of nights that someone was staying at a hotel and you just didn't hear that, or you didn't take any notes on that. It's better to just guess than to put nothing. So you heard a conversation, so you probably know if they're planning to stay 1 or 2 nights versus 6 months. So you can have a ballpark figure. So you can just guess maybe 3 nights if you think that they were talking about a short visit. So there should be something from the conversation that can help you have a guess, but a guess is better than a blank answer. Some other ways to prepare are to listen to as much content in English as possible. So that applies to all forms of content that you can think of. So practice tests, of course, are a great way to practice for this test, but also television, movies, any kind of video, music, or any other content that you can think of that is in English. Of course, reading and doing other things in English, reading and writing, that's great too. And it's good for other sections of the test too, but specifically for the listening portion of the test, you should just try to hear as many English speakers as possible. Native English speakers are best for trying to learn accents and pronunciation, but also if you're listening to a show that has a lot of people who are not native English speakers, but they're speaking English, then that can help to train your ear too, because often they will have an accent that is not the accent that you're used to hearing. So all of that is helpful. Listen to things for fun and listen to more academic things while taking notes. So you can do both. So sometimes you can study, maybe listening to a TED Talk, taking notes, comparing to a transcript. Those topics are, you can choose fun topics, things that interest you, instead of choosing incredibly boring subjects that you have no interest in at all. So it can be a little bit fun, but you should try to have a variety of topics that you listen to. But then if you want to just have some of your fun stuff in your day be in English, then that's great. So watch favorite TV shows, movies that are from a genre that you enjoy. Do those things in English and count that as part of your studying time. Of course, you need to study in addition to that, but it still helps a lot to listen to content that is in English. So don't forget that that can help you prepare as well. Active listening is important, but extra listening practice in English is always helpful too. So active listening where you are planning to study, where you think you are going to be preparing for the test by doing this. So sitting down, listening to a TED Talk or listening to an IELTS test sample question. That is very active listening and it feels like studying, and that's great. It's very necessary. But any extra listening that you can fit into your day in English is helpful too. So even if you're listening to music in English and you're not doing that active part of trying to write down the lyrics and then reading the lyrics and comparing and listening again, just listening to the music is helpful. So if you think, oh, it's not helpful to listen to music because I don't have time to write down the lyrics and compare and read, because I listen to music every day when I'm exercising at the gym, then don't discount that. You can still listen to music while you're exercising, while you're doing other things. If it's in English, your brain is still taking in English information. It's getting accustomed to hearing people speaking in English. So even if you're not studying, extra English is always great and helpful. You should try to listen to a wide range of types of situations to learn new vocabulary. So, for example, even if you're listening to some things for fun, like watching TV or listening to music, try to watch something and listen to something that is not what you always watch. So maybe you always watch medical shows. You love shows that are set in hospitals. So you should do that, but also maybe watch something that is a comedy, or watch something that is horror, or watch something that is crime. Crime shows have very difficult vocabulary, but that's very helpful. You can learn a lot of new words. And if you have subtitles on while you watch it, then of course that's very helpful, and you'll see the spelling of those words as well. Comedy can be a great way if you're not someone who normally watches comedy. Comedy is a great way to hear a lot of slang, a lot of idioms, a lot of very casual speech. So I think that can be a great way to hear some people speaking in a very informal way. So be sure not to only listen to the types of things that you love, even though I do recommend that you do some of those things in English too. Even for TED Talks, watch mostly ones that you enjoy, but if maybe you find science or psychology TED Talks to be incredibly boring, it's still worth listening to a couple of them. Try to choose some that don't sound as boring. Don't only listen to your favorite things in one category. And again, I will say to listen to content in a variety of accents, not just North American accents or not just British accents. So you need to be familiar with both. So maybe if you watch TV and you always watch TV that was made in the US, you need to start watching a little bit of TV that is from the UK. Or even from Australia or from Scotland or Ireland. Those are different accents that if your ear is trained to understand North American English, it can be very difficult to understand those other accents. But they are equally as valid, and they're very popular as well in other places. And even in North America, there are a lot of British speakers, a lot of people with British accents who have moved here. So be sure to have a variety. And of course, my final piece of advice is always to practice, practice, practice. So as much practice as you can get will be helpful. So read the types of questions, listen to the types of audio that are on the test, and just do as much as you can to prepare. Don't leave it until the last minute. Sometimes students will come to me or to tutors in general with only a few weeks before their IELTS test, and they want to see a dramatic improvement in a short amount of time, and that is just not possible. So if you've been studying for months or for years and you want a tutor for your final few weeks, that's fine, but you can't expect to see a really steep increase in your language ability in weeks. So the longer that you have to prepare for this, the better. If you speak English, then it's hard to see a dramatic change in your level of English in a short amount of time, unless you're living somewhere where you speak English every minute of the day for many months, then usually you won't be able to notice big changes in your level of speech. Or your level of listening comprehension. So it is just important to plan ahead, give yourself enough time. If you have done these types of questions dozens or hundreds of times before the test, you will feel so much more confident and so much less nervous going into the test, and that will serve you very well. You will get a higher score just because you're not as stressed. Someone who just started studying a few weeks before the IELTS test who walks in is probably going to be much more nervous, unless they really don't care about what they get, but that's quite rare. Usually people care quite a lot because it's important to get a high score on these tests for getting into many schools. So yeah, give yourself time. And then the more practice that you get, the more comfortable you will feel, and the less nervous you'll feel during the test. So be sure to practice as much as possible. And that is all for the listening section of the IELTS test. Be sure to join us again for our next video.